In this fifth video about the global trends and specifically looking at the increase of the executive power, we will look at the state-owned enterprises, what we call today the public-private enterprises, and also the public-private agreements, what we call the PPEs, and other issues in order to underscore the point that the executive power is increasing at the cost of the legislative and the judiciary in Namibia. Now, one has to remember that the executive is not only referring to the president and the cabinet, but is also referring to the public service. All the offices, ministries, and agencies that form part of the public sector is considered part of the executive. And that's the implementation arm of the executive. The executive, the president, and the cabinet needs to implement the decisions of parliament, the legislative, while at the same time the executive, the cabinet, sits in parliament, and we have talked about that in, I think, the first or the second video in this series. Now, the increasing bureaucracy in Namibia that have already been described in 2003 by some scholars as bloated, ineffective, and inefficient. And on that score, still today, if we look at the number of public servants per capita, we have some of the highest number of public servants in that regard in the whole world. And given the small population, we have a large geographical size. One can, to some extent, understand why we have a big public service, because public services need to be scattered around the country in order to provide accessibility to goods and services. However, I don't think that is mainly the reason for the inefficient and ineffectiveness of the public service and the unproductiveness. By focusing on the public sector in general, before we look at the different public private enterprises, it's important to realize that the public service has grown in Namibia, that the police is seen as separate of the public service, that the defense force is seen as separate as the public service. In terms of the legislation, the Public Service Act, because we have the Police Act, we have also the Defense Act, and then we also have the Public Service Act. And then for all the different public private enterprises created, formerly called the state-owned enterprises, that have been replaced by a new legislation. New means already old, means that, for example, NAM Water is created by its own legislation, NAM Power Electricity Company by its own legislation, and so all public enterprises being created by its own legislation that makes it a cumbersome procedure, while we could have created public-private enterprises in a different format without creating separate legislation as some other countries have done. But that's also another point of discussion. Now, the public service, it's very difficult to get the numbers of how many public servants we have. Teachers form a great part of the public service, and then also laborers, and then we also have the to put it that way, and the public service is all the conditions of service has been in the hands of the Public Service Commission, appointed by the president, and the Public Service Commission report then also to the Office of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister is the head of government, the administrative arm of the public service. Now, there was an extensive increase in the number of defence force that have recently been, not recently, in the time of COVID, or just before or after COVID, it has been reduced and then increased last year, the previous year, 2023. The same with the police. So the number of public servants is about approximately about 130,000, and then in addition to that, another 30,000 of the defence force, and also probably 25,000 of the police. Then we have several state-owned enterprises, not several but hundreds of them, that have luxurious salaries, and we call it privatization, but it's actually not privatization. Is a public-private enterprise that is still in the hands of the government. It's not a private enterprise. It's more an attempt to commercialize, and we have some form of commercialization, as we can say, like the MTC, for example. But most of the public enterprises still belong to the government by far, and sometimes, most of the time, also the only shareholder. So one way to grow a public service without people realizing it is by creating more agencies, like and public-private enterprises in Namibia, and there are a number of them as the population grow, like the Namibian Institute of Pathology, then also the regulators like NAMCOR for the petroleum, that also compete with the private sector and determine the policy, and then also the CRAN, the Communication Regulation Authority of Namibia, the Competition Commission, the Electricity Control Board, and several other regulators. Now, we also have seen that in the electricity space, we have NamWater as the supplier of electricity, and then we have Irongo Red as the distributor. The Irongo area of Swakopmund, Indus Bay, that area, where the specific agency has been created for the distribution of electricity between the bulk supplier and the municipality, that add costs onto the consumer, and if inefficient, the consumer pay more for that, as it seems to be actually the case. So these are all monopolies, like, for example, Nored, Irongo Red, Senored. They are all monopolies, and they don't compete with anybody else, and that means they don't have to be efficient and effective. And that applies to most of the public enterprises in Namibia, with reference to the Namibian Financial Assistance Fund, that have endured a number of scandals with the building of a large building, with several cases of corruption, from the buying of the land to the construction to the building certificates, complying certificate of the building itself, also extended to the inspection and all that. And then we have the Namibia Training Authority, that is another monopoly with huge inefficiencies. So we have seen an increase of that. Under the defense, we have also seen August 26, that's a holding company for a number of smaller companies under defense. And that's another way to grow the public service without having the ability, the accountability, or the liability to ask any questions in Parliament about defense spending, as August 26 have never supplied any financial statements to Parliament, and an attempt by the late President to provide audit report has have never materialized since its inception, I think in 1998, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, early 2000s, when the August 26 was created. Then there was another scandal about the buying of farms by the Defence Force for the old club of the Defence Force under the pretense of training exercises that have been exposed by the Patriot. It's another example of the increasing of the bureaucracy at the expense of the legislative, the judiciary, and the citizens of this country, and where the Patriot had won the case, and it was in their right to disclose this type of information. So that underscored the importance of the media in trying to holding the executive accountable and liable. And then another form of increase of the executive is by appointing board members on companies like Meatco, the agricultural board, then also the Namibian Farmers Association, then also on several other boards, where government have the prerogative of the minister to appoint half and more of those members without necessarily having the skills, the skills in order to hold government accountable, because they actually act on behalf of government. That's another way of increasing bureaucracy that has happened in Namibia, compared to private institutions where in a private company or a limited company or a close corporation, shareholders can hold these board members accountable. If a minister appoints a board member, then that person is first and foremost accountable to the minister and not to the shareholders. In most cases, the only shareholder anyway is the government. And we have seen the involvement of different ministers in public-private enterprises. For example, in the case of Meatco, it was Mr. Mutorwa involving in that board. Also in terms of different other boards where the ministers have intervened, like for example in terms of the Sports Commission, the Minister of Sport, Ms. Chongareru, and also with the different media agencies, like the NBC, for example, and also Neo Era. That is a media, state-owned media platform. That is another form of using propaganda paid by taxpayers to provide the political narrative of a government, where the increase of the executive is at the expense of the taxpayers, and taxpayers doesn't have an insight or being the ability to sit on such support of the Neo Era in order to hold the government accountable. Now, this is a clear indication that we have several examples in Namibia of the increase of the executive at the expense of the legislative and the judiciary, and then obviously the customers. Some of the most extreme examples have been dealt with in another series about where I asked the question, or the title is board games, the abuse of power and politics, where I specifically look at public enterprises that already failed and some other that is on the cards to fail. So some of those that have failed already, Air Namibia, for example, overrun by politicians. They couldn't survive, and while just after independence it made profit in the time of Mr. Francois Eist, the CEO, until it was so due of political abuse that the end Air Namibia had to bailed out several times over the years. I think with more than 10 billion by the government taxpayers' money. And at the end, we don't have any national airline anymore. Then also the Small Medium Enterprise Bank, and that's in a specific video I've dealt with that. The idea was to provide money to, for example, small medium enterprises, and also public agencies were encouraged to donate money for seed funding of the small medium enterprise, what we call as SME bank. And there was there was a minister sitting on that board, the Secretary of Cabinet sitting on that board, and then a former Minister of Agriculture, later also from the National Planning Commission, and that some political connected people, even those chairmen that served on the board, made use of the funds of the SME, and they have never paid it back. And currently there are several cases filed against that, and one of that include the Secretary to Cabinet that is on contract now, Mr. George Mata, the current Minister of Defense, Minister Frans Kapoffie, and the other person is Mr. But I call Mr. 10%. He's known as Mr. 10%. I think it was Mr. Ndisishi. And it was a complete failure, and not just a failure, but the Bank of Namibia was supposed to oversee the SME bank, and they have been blind to the outflow of money to Zimbabwe and to Namibia, and also the Financial Intelligence Agency follow a procedure of see nothing, hear nothing. It couldn't, according to them, couldn't follow the trials, the financial transaction trial that's been left behind, and until now nobody's in jail for that. So this is an example where you create an agency for abuse, political abuse, huge corruption, I think 270 million plus, and nobody being held accountable. Another example is the GIPF scandal, in the region of 600 million plus million left being looted, business plans approved of business and political connected people never paid it back, and according to informers, the National Intelligence have confiscated the motherboards of those PCs, and there are no evidence available to prosecute people for that, and allegedly one minister also being involved with that specific case. A well-known, not minister, a judge. So this is an example that if you create an executive that is not accountable to the parliament, because they sit in parliament and there's not enough checks and balances, then you will have a mushrooming effect where you see a situation where the executive that's supposed to oversee the implementation of the legislative decisions, creating more institutions of extraction in order for political abuse and also for the ruling party abuse. And in Namibia, 34 years after independence, we still have the same liberation movement in place, and we have seen a deterioration of the economic indicators in Namibia with reference to the highest debt to GDP ratio ever in the history, 70% plus. The highest unemployment of graduates in Namibia, 40% plus, and unemployment in Namibia of 30% plus. Education failure of 75% of grade 11s end of 2023 that cannot study further. We have seen a deterioration of foreign direct investment and outflows since 2014 and 15 due to NIP and NIF. We have seen several legislation that I've dealt with in the previous videos that underscore the point of increase of the executive at the cost of the judiciary. And we have seen also regulators like NAMCOR that I've dealt with in that video about board games, where NAMCOR tick all the boxes of the judge, jury, and the prosecutor, as well as the end customer. That is a perfect example of how to create abuse of power by a regulator that have become an institution of extraction with enormous corruption in NAMCOR unfolding in different newspapers during over the years. And that is not limited, but also extend to academic institutions. Yes. Then, so I would like to conclude this specific video then to say there is definitely proof that with legislation and public enterprises, offices, agencies, and ministries, the increase of the public service, the increase of the discretion of the ministers in legislation, then also with in terms of development frameworks, economic frameworks like the new Equitable Economic Empowerment Framework, and then also with NEP, and also with the amendment of the Constitution over time, increasing of the powers of the President. We have seen how the executive power have increased their power, and I would like to end with the attempt by one of the highest leaders in the judiciary system that have attempted to change the or to make it to make it legal that if specific certain cases could have been held in camera, with reference to the fish rod case. There was an attempt as available in the newspapers a few years ago where Mr. Tamasek attempted to make that legal, that the fish rod case being held in camera. And that means that whatever have happened in the fish rod case, with the ministers being accountable and two of them in jail at the moment, and the government's involvement and the ruling party would not have been disclosed. This is an example of how the executive power is also abusing the judiciary power, and people lose also their trust in the government, and we have seen in growing apathy of especially young people over time that have lost trust, not in government agencies. And that is the result, to some extent, of the increase of the executive power. And so thank you very much.